Italy about how it is here as well afterwards. But I just wanted to say a bit about my work before we begin, so you know the kind of thing I do. So this is my website, Rewriting the Rules. So if you want to learn more about my stuff, there's blogs and zines and videos and connections to my books on here. Mostly what I do is writing self-help kind of books or basic kind of books about gender, sexuality and relationships for a general audience, but drawing on psychology, sociology, trying to bring the knowledge that we have to a bigger audience, because I feel like a lot of the material that you get for, you know, if you're interested in gender, it's like men are from Mars, women are from Venus or something. You know, if you walk into a bookshop, and I'm very passionate about getting better information out there to everybody about gender and sex and relationships. So a lot of my books are the self-help kind of books, but I've also published for therapists and practitioners on these topics, and also I've done academic research, particularly around bisexuality, kink, BDSM, also polyamory, non-monogamies, and now trans and non-binary genders. The other website that might be interesting to you that I'm involved with is this one, Meg-John-Justin.com. So this is a project with my colleague Justin Hancock, who's a sex educator for young people, and we put together a podcast for people to listen to about sex and relationships, and also again a number of free resources around sex and relationships for young adults, but also at any age really. So those two websites you can find out about. But today, this is what we're talking about. So non-binary gender. And this talk is based on a chapter that I wrote. So there's a trans activist in the UK called Christine Burns, who's been working in that area for, well, I don't know, 30 years. She was one of the most important people early in the trans movement in terms of getting legal recognition in the UK for trans people in their gender. And so recently she put together a book called Trans Britain, and this book was kind of a history of the trans movement in Britain so far. And she asked me and my colleagues to write the chapter on non-binary. So it's quite an exciting project to be part of, because there's people writing, you know, from the 1950s onwards about the trans movement in Britain. But we're coming in, me and my colleagues, at the end of the book with almost like the most recent thing that's happening in transgender, which is the non-binary movement. So it's a funny thing to write a history about because it's so recent. But this, you know, this talk is basically the very recent history of the non-binary movement. And I wrote that with Ben Vincent, who is an academic in the UK who did the first PhD on non-binary gender that I'm aware of, but certainly the first one in the UK. And also Joss Twist, who is a non-binary clinician, practitioner, who's working in the Tavistock, which is our clinic in London for young trans people. So again, quite a, you know, to be trans and non-binary themselves and then working with young people in that clinic is quite a new thing. Like before, most of the clinicians there have been cisgender rather than trans themselves. So it's an exciting time in Britain, but it's also, there's kind of good and bad going on. We're in the midst of a moral panic about transgender as well. Like pretty much every week there's 2, 3 or 4 news stories about trans in the press, and most of them are negative. There's a real battle going on within feminism between trans-positive feminists and anti-trans feminists. And it's just playing out in the media all the time. It's like documentaries about trans. We just had one last week, another one that's very negative about trans people. The politicians are trying to revise the process by which you get recognition for your gender, and that has kept everything in the news. So at the same time that there's this kind of positive move forward and a lot of people writing on these issues in the UK, a lot of academics studying it, a lot of improvement in gender services, at the same time there's this real media backlash, there's a lot of negativity, high level of stigma, and we're living in this fraught time. It feels everyone is feeling it very viscerally, you know, every day you kind of feel this onslaught of kind of, you pick up a newspaper or you turn on TV and there are people representing you and misrepresenting you all over the place. And I suspect that non-binary gender will become more and more a focus because it's a battleground around sort of an old way of understanding gender as very much there are men and there are women, and men should be masculine, women should be feminine, and then a new way of understanding gender, which is to question really whether it isn't more of a diversity or a spectrum, and that's where we are. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, non-binary, that phrase, is probably the most common word, certainly in Britain, it's the most common phrase to describe anyone who doesn't experience their gender as man or woman. So just that umbrella term that encompasses anyone who doesn't experience themselves as man or woman. In the US, genderqueer seems to be used as more the umbrella term for that. In the UK, more non-binary. There are other words that people are using as well, but those seem to be the most common in the English-speaking world, as far as I'm aware. And I guess it's important to recognise there are a lot of different experiences under that umbrella. So this is just part of a project they did in San Francisco. It was called a sort of identity project, and most of the people there would fall broadly under the non-binary umbrella, but you can see very different identity terms, very different expressions of gender. So that's important to remember. It's not, you know, everyone under non-binary has very different experiences. I like this picture of David Bowie dressed as Tilda Swinton and Tilda Swinton dressed as David Bowie. And it says gender is between your ears, not between your legs. So I guess they're two kind of famous examples of people who are messing with gender or being androgynous or some kind of non-binary. So thinking about non-binary people's descriptions of their gender, some people experience their gender as static, so something that stays the same over time. They might say, I've always known that I was something other than man or woman, and that's never changed. You know, I still feel it the same way as I felt when I was 5 or when I was 15, when I was 25. For other people, gender feels much more fluid, and people who experience their gender as fluid could be captured under that non-binary umbrella, that is something that shifts over time. Maybe somebody started life feeling quite comfortably masculine and it's changed gradually over time to something much more feminine, or maybe it changes over the course of a month, you know, or even the course of a day, that there are times when they feel more masculine, more feminine, or maybe not feeling very gendered at all. So it can be static or fluid. It can be strong. Some of us who are non-binary have a very strong sense of our gender. It can be muted. So quite a lot of people use this sort of word demi-girl or demi-boy to refer to it not being a very strong aspect of their identity or their experience. Like gender is a bit muted, it's not that important maybe. Or partial. Or it can be non-existent, so people who call themselves non-gendered, agender, gender neutral. It's a sense of not really having a gender. And again, there's some very diverse experience there, right? So for some of us, a very strong sense of gender. Being non-binary is really important, and our sense of our gender is really important. All the way to people who it's just not an important feature. They might say, gender is as important to me as eye colour or hair colour. It's not a really important feature of my identity. People differ as well how it relates to the binary. So some people feel who are non-binary say they still have an idea that there are binary genders, there is man and woman, and they feel that maybe they're somewhere between those two on a spectrum, or maybe they encompass elements of both. But they still buy the idea that there are sort of man and woman, and it's just where they locate themselves in relation to that. Whereas other people, it's like they want to break the whole binary, or they just don't experience that binary of man and woman or masculine and feminine as making any sense to them. They might be more calling themselves a third gender or pangender, for example. And finally, there's a distinction of whether being non-binary is something of a personal experience or whether it's political, or again, whether it's an element of both. Some people who use the terms like gender fuck or gender queer are coming from a more political space of like thinking that the gender binary is bad for people, maybe bad for everybody, and wanting to politically question that. And maybe their personal gender expression is a part of that political work, maybe particularly maybe artists who are doing things differently with gender, that might be part of a political project. But it also may be personal, and for some people it's personal without any political part. It's just, this is how I experience myself, and it's nothing to do with trying to change the world. It's just, this is who I am. So all of that comes under the umbrella of non-binary, and different people experience it different ways. So how common is it? How many people are non-binary? First of all, it's worth saying, well, where does non-binary fit in relation to transgender, or being trans? If we identify trans in the way that mostly it's identified these days, mostly the definition of trans is somebody who doesn't remain in the gender that they were assumed to be at birth, right? So in some way changes from the gender that when the doctor said it's a boy or it's a girl, you know, they're not anymore in that gender. Well, in that case, non-binary people would all be seen as trans, because the doctor generally says it's a boy or it's a girl. So if you're non-binary, you're not fitting into that gender that was assumed or assigned to you at birth. But not all non-binary people see themselves as transgender. Some see being trans as something that definitely involves a medical transition, and not all non-binary people go through surgeries or hormones, but some of us do. So some people feel like they can't really use that word, transgender. And some people see the distinction between transgender and cisgender as another binary. You know, you're either trans or you're cis, and they're trying to say, well, maybe that's not a binary either, maybe that's a spectrum. You know, some of us change further away from the gender that we were assumed to be at birth than others. So maybe we should question the binary between trans people and cis people. It's also important to remember that on no element of sex or gender is there a clear-cut binary. So the way that people will often think, well, you know, biologically, there are just males and females. You know, when you look at intersex experience, for example, you see that even with chromosomes, there's a whole range of different chromosomes that people can have in terms of the sex chromosomes. Levels of hormones in the body, there are some men that have much lower levels of testosterone than some women, for example. The brain, you know, researchers now found that there isn't such a thing as a clear-cut male or female brain. Most of us have elements of both going on. So on no level really is there a clear-cut binary that we could say all of those people are male, all of those people are female. It's different, you know, there is diversity across all levels of biological sex and social gender. But still, the question remains, well, how many people would say identify themselves as non-binary? In the UK, somebody called Nat Titman did a review of all of the surveys, the national surveys that kind of ask people their gender. I mean, they found, first of all, that very few surveys have a space for anything other than male or female. So most surveys will say, what's your gender, male or female? There is no space to write other, you know, some different gender. But when they do ask for that, Nat found about 0.4% of people would say something other than male or female, which is like 1 in 250. So you could say, and this was really before the non-binary gender movement took off, so this may well have changed, probably it's a lot higher now, but back then, about 1 in 250 people were saying that they were non-binary. Another interesting one is, more recently, the government did a survey in the UK of LGBT people, and they got 7,000 responses from non-binary people, and that was actually more than the number of responses from trans men and trans women put together. So it seems that this is an identity which is definitely increasing, and particularly among young people. So again, I feel like probably it would be higher than 0.4% if they were to do that study again today. I don't know if you're familiar with Daphne Joel's research out in Israel, but they asked a very different question. Instead of identity, they asked people about their experience, and they studied the general population. They said, how many people, or do you feel, to some extent, the other gender, or both genders, or neither gender, in terms of your lived experience? And 35% of people said they felt to some extent the other gender, both or neither. So you could say that over a third of people are non-binary, according to that definition of experience. And this is where it's so important to think about, identity versus experience, right? It's the same with bisexuality. If you ask how many people identify as bisexual, it might be as low as 2 or 3%. But if you find out how many people experience attraction to more than one gender, again, it's much more like a third to a half of people, depending on the age of the people you're asking. So it's a similar thing with non-binary gender to bisexuality. And yeah, we can continue to ask the question, how many people would identify if it was available? If our world was set up that it assumed that people are either man, woman, or non-binary, and that was everywhere, and there was toilets everywhere for non-binary people, and all of their forms had another category, how many people then? It's a really interesting question. So, thinking about the history, it's really important to remember this isn't a new thing. So whenever the UK media reports on this, or the US media that I've seen on it as well, usually it's presented as this new thing, it's fashionable. It's kind of, the young people are doing it and it's just a fashionable trend and it will go away again at some point. But no, there's deep historical precedence for non-binary gender. C.N. Lester is a non-binary performer in the UK who's written a book which I'll mention in a moment. Talks about Shakespeare's boy players, the boys who used to play, to act as women in Shakespearean plays, for example, as potentially a historical precedent for non-binary people, or the people who went to the Molly houses in London in the 19th century, where again there was a lot of playing with gender and different gender roles taking place. Also globally, we know that cultures don't all have binary gender systems. So this is quite a Western thing, but there are many cultures around the world that don't have 2 genders. There may be 3, there may be 5, or there may be, gender just may not be such an important attribute of a person as it is in Western culture at the moment. But we also have to be really careful not to just claim those historical precedents or that cultural variation. So it's tempting for non-binary activists to say, oh yes, those boy players, they were non-binary people back in Shakespeare's time. Or, yeah, people in Thailand represent the same thing as non-binary people in the West. We need to be really cautious about that, because that also involves us imposing our gender system on people in the past or people around the world in different cultures, which is also problematic and quite colonialist thing to be doing, so we need to be careful. But we can say, I think, that non-binary gender is not a recent phenomenon. And in fact, the idea that there are opposite sexes, that men and women are opposite to each other, and that men are from Mars, women are from Venus kind of way, that is quite a new way of thinking and a very Western way of thinking. It's not how everybody sees gender around the world, and it's certainly not how it was seen everywhere in the past. So it's worth kind of questioning that, this whole blue and pink thing. In fact, even those colours, apparently in Britain anyway, back in the Victorian times, so back in, I guess, the late 19th century, it was reversed. So blue was the colour for girls and pink was the colour for boys. So even something like that and there are scientists who try and prove that, somehow women are more drawn to pink and men are more drawn to blue. But we can dispute that really easily by pointing out that it used to be the other way around. And blue was seen as this very delicate, blue was seen as a very delicate colour that was suitable for girls, and pink was a strong, decided colour for boys, right? Then also there's more recent roots of non-binary gender or non-binary thinking that we need to acknowledge. So again, this shows that it's not completely a new thing. This novel, Woman on the Edge of Time, by Marge Percy, was a feminist in the 1970s. Imagines a future in which everybody, there is no gender, so everybody uses the pronoun her, and they're just all human beings, and there is no sense of who's a man and who's a woman. And the woman who's the main character in the novel goes forward in time, and it's about her struggles of understanding this culture where everyone's non-binary and everyone's polyamorous as well, so they all have multiple relationships. And then Sandra Benn, who those of you who are psychology students might be familiar with, again a feminist working back in the 1970s, did the Benn inventory of gender and studied androgyny a lot. And I find her very interesting because in the 1970s she was arguing from a feminist perspective that we should stop seeing gender as an important part of a person. You know, we should treat men and women equally, and the way to do that was to see gender as something fairly insignificant. Again, maybe just as important as eye colour, an interesting feature of a person, but it didn't really drive anything important about a person. It certainly didn't mean that certain people were suited for different jobs, for example, and everyone should be paid the same. And she said she changed her mind in the 1990s because she said this project in feminism of dialing down the volume on gender, or of trying to prove that men and women were pretty much the same, she said that's not working. Like, we've been trying to do that for 20 years and it's not working. So let's do something else instead. And I'll read you the quote because it's so interesting. She said, "I propose that we let 1,000 categories of sex, gender and desire begin to blossom in any and all fluid and permeable configurations, and through that very proliferation, that we thereby undo the privileged status of the two and only two that are currently treated as normal and natural. That we begin to madly and exuberantly proliferate ourselves in as many categories of sex, gender and desire as we seem to need." So this was the 1990s, and she was basically arguing that if we could have this sense of gender diversity and millions of different genders and sexualities and desires, then that would break the binary, and that would be we would reach the feminist goal of equality that way. Instead of dialing down the volume, we dial up the volume, so everybody has a unique gender. And I just think it's fascinating that she was almost predicting the future at that point in the 1990s when she said that, because that is kind of what we have now, maybe with Facebook having 70 categories that people can choose for their gender. Also, queer theory is a theory that's all about challenging binaries of gender and sexuality. So when that kind of emerged in the 1990s, that was what queer theory was trying to do. And I've written a comic book guide to queer theory, if that's something anyone's interested in. And then trans studies and trans activism, again, back in 1990s and 2000s, people like Kate Bornstein and Nikki Wilkins were writing books that were, again, questioning the idea that gender is binary and putting forward more diversity in terms of gender. So I'll give you a bit of history of where we're at in the UK with this. And as I said, it's such a recent history. You know, we're starting in sort of the 1990s, but really it's only since 2010 that anything like a non-binary movement has existed. So when Ben and Joss and I were writing our chapter that the talk is based on, we actually had to go and talk to Christy Ellen Kane and Nat Titman. They were two activists in the non-binary movement who were working right back in the 1990s and 2000s. So we interviewed them and asked them to tell us what was it like back then. And Christy Ellen Kane from Non-Gendered, who is a big campaigner for getting an X on passports, so not everybody has to have male or female on their passport, there's also an X category. Christy said it was almost impossible to be a non-binary activist in the 1990s. There were no words, you know, the word non-binary wasn't there. There was no awareness, so everyone thought it was very weird. And the lack of internet meant that you couldn't connect online with other non-binary people, so Christy felt very alone back fighting for non-binary rights back when there was nothing called non-binary. Then Nat Titman said that there was a shift from around the 2000 point, that before that, anyone who was doing this kind of activism, they were sort of trying to dismantle the gender binary. So they were often coming from a quite academic perspective of wanting to sort of point out that the binary between men and women is a problem and is kind of broken, doesn't really work. It's from the 2000 to the 2010, there was a shift to focusing on getting rights for non-binary people. So instead of doing this quite political activist dismantling the binary, it was like, how do we get rights for people to live their lives as non-binary people? There's kind of a shift from a queer politics to a more of an identity politics, really. And that kind of argument works better with politicians, I guess. So the politicians started to pay attention when the argument was more like, here's a group of people, there's 7,000 of them according to your survey, we need to give them rights, we need to protect them, we need to give them equality. But again, it's another false binary, really, the binary between a kind of queer politics and a radical politics on one hand, and a more strategic and identity politics on another, because a lot of people will do different strategies on different occasions, depending on who they're talking to and what kind of outcomes they're trying to get for non-binary people. So 2011 was really a pivotal year. That's when campaigners managed to get the MUX, so instead of Mr. or Miss or Mrs., this MUX title got some recognition on some of the policies and application forms in the UK. So banks now quite often offer MUX as an alternative, so it's a gender-neutral title. So 2011 was kind of when that happened. Also the WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, started to include non-binary people around 2011. And then in 2013, there was a change to the DSM-5, so the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. They changed from gender disorder to gender dysphoria, which helped alleviate some of the stigma of mental illness around trans people, but that also encompassed non-binary in a way that the gender disorder category hadn't. So that was a kind of more global shift. And in the UK in 2014, we began to see some websites for non-binary people, Beyond the Binary and the Non-Binary Inclusion Project. And Stonewall UK, which is one of our big LGBT campaigning groups, they started to, well, first of all, they started to include T, because they'd been LGB before that, now they're LGBT. And when they were consulting trans people, they had a group of us non-binary people to consult specifically. So there was again this recognition that non-binary is part of that trans umbrella. In 2015, there was the first push for the government to recognise non-binary people and to enable non-binary people to self-define as non-binary rather than having to be, at the moment, you still have to define as either a man or a woman if you're a trans person. And first of all, the politicians rejected that, and they said only a very small number of people consider themselves to be neither gender, and we're not aware that it results in any specific detriment. That was the kind of quote. So on Twitter, all of the non-binary activists had this hashtag, specific detriment, and they were listing all the problems they experienced in everyday life because they didn't identify as a man or a woman. So it's a really interesting example of social media activism that became the hashtag, and then people were listing all the problems they had because of being non-binary. And of course it is extremely hard to live your everyday life if you don't define as a man or a woman. You're constantly having to fill in forms that only give you male or female boxes, or go to the toilet and choose between the man or the woman. So certainly you're often misgendered when you go to a cafe. Mostly, you know, somebody will call you sir or madam, and they won't consider any other title. And 2016 saw a trans equality report in the UK that included non-binary people. There was the first non-binary conference, and that was when Ben Vincent got their PhD on non-binary people, and also a non-binary person was recognised by the Queen. So they were the first MUX, MUX Jen Lockney was given an award by the Queen. So where are we going next? I guess, again, it's relevant to you as psychologists that probably the big issues for non-binary people are around mental health. So mental health problems amongst non-binary people are pretty bad and pretty equivalent to those amongst trans men and trans women, which we already know to be pretty bad, if not worse in some cases. So some studies found non-binary people struggle even more than trans men and women. Certainly it's equivalent in terms of suicide risk and depression, anxiety, self-harm, this kind of thing. Harrison et al.'s US study found that over 40% of the non-binary people they surveyed had attempted suicide at some point. A third had experienced physical assault based on their gender, and a sixth had experienced sexual assault based on their gender. So it's a lot of discrimination, a lot of hate crime, a lot of microaggressions day to day for people who express themselves or identify as non-binary. Scottish Trans did a study where they found that 3/4 of non-binary people avoided situations in their life because they were fearful of harassment or being misgendered. And 2/3 of non-binary people never felt included in services, so they never felt there was space for them in education or in the workplace or in healthcare. And indeed that is the case. You know, most of those places don't recognise the existence still of non-binary people, although it's beginning to change. And universities are one of the first places in general in the UK that are beginning to have policies and practices that recognise non-binary people. But again, there's a big battle going on. So there are some academics in the UK who are fighting very hard against the inclusion of non-binary people and saying that non-binary doesn't exist. So we're still fighting that battle for the very existence of non-binary. And these are just some of the things that when we researched it, non-binary people wanted. So they want a right to self-determine as non-binary for sure, data protection, they want the recognition of gender-neutral pronouns like they pronouns, they want equality legislation to include them specifically, more support, more resources, more education, better media, more access to medical health care, better public spaces, so changing rooms in shops as well to be inclusive of non-binary people. The one at the bottom is interesting, so there is a bit more awareness around non-binary, but what a lot of people pointed out in the research is that when people imagine a non-binary person, if there's any visibility at all, it tends to be a certain kind of person. White, young, slim, not disabled, you know, the usual. So certainly there's a sense of how do we increase the diversity of images of what a non-binary person looks like. And again, Twitter has been interesting. There's been a campaign and a hashtag, this is what non-binary looks like. And initially you got a million pictures of somebody who fitted, you know, somebody with colourful hair, slim, white, young. And then, you know, there were these offshoots on Twitter of like, here's images of older non-binary people, here's images of non-binary people of colour. So this sort of tendency to start to be much more mindful of intersectionality and aware that non-binary people don't all look a certain way. And indeed, a lot of people may look on the surface very masculine or feminine, but their experience of themselves may be as non-binary. So that's an important thing to recognise. Not all non-binary people look androgynous. They may look very masculine or feminine too. So this is just sort of getting on to where we are now in the last year. There's been a lot of shift. This is the Facebook options now of all the different genders people can choose from. This is the hashtag I was just mentioning. This is what non-binary looks like. The TV show Billions, which is a US TV show, had a non-binary character, Taylor, who was played by a non-binary actor called Asia Kate Dillon, and that's them there. And that's really interesting to me because as somebody who researches trans and LGBT in general, I mean, what you usually notice with media representation, if you think about lesbian, gay, bisexual or trans people, like 30 years ago, we were only there as evil villains, you know? Like, first of all, you get to be an evil villain on all of the TV shows if you're LGBT. then a victim. You know, so a lot of the depictions of LGBT people, it's tragic, you know, they die, it's like somebody dying of AIDS if it's a gay man, or it's a trans sex worker being killed on a crime show. You know, you're only depicted as the victim in the tragic narrative. And then very gradually you might get to a point where there are, you know, hospital dramas have the trans episode, and it's not really terrible, but it's not great, it's still a bit sensationalist. And then finally we get to the point, you know, where maybe gay people are being represented, and being gay is not the most important part of them. You know, they might be just on a soap opera and it happens to be a gay couple, and we feel like we've got to a good point of representation at that point. But with non-binary gender, it's like we've just jumped straight to the positive depiction, because this is, you know, the thing about Taylor and Billions is they're just a character on that show who happens to be non-binary. There's no, you know, they're not an evil villain, they're not a victim, it's just, you know, they're non-binary. And, you know, it seems like they haven't had to go through all of this kind of process to get to here, but actually we're having positive depiction straight away. And I find that really fascinating. So the non-binary movement is very new, but it seems to have moved very fast in a short space of time. And like the asexual movement, I guess, it's a very recent one, but one that seems to have moved quite quickly in just the space of a few years. So I think there's something very interesting happening there, that the newer sexualities and genders that are emerging aren't necessarily going through that same old long process that we've had to go through in terms of LGBT. And yeah, as I say, the place we're in the UK at the moment is there has been a lot of raised awareness, there's been a lot of positive media. This is the book by C.M. Lester that came out called Trans Like Me, which is a really excellent book about media depictions, and did very well. And there's been a number of other books by non-binary authors that have been doing well. But at the same time, we've got the strong backlash against it, and we're having to fight again for our very existence. And that's where I'll leave it, so we'll have some time for question and answer. Again, if you're interested in the topic, I know Antonio can send around a paper that I wrote that's a really brief overview that's in the Journal of Psychiatry, so it's a bit more of a serious academic paper. But also these books, this is the queer comic that I mentioned. This is a much more academic clinical book on non-binary and genderqueer genders. And then this is a more self-help book on how to understand your gender, which would be useful for non-binary people, but hopefully also for everyone, because it's not just non-binary people who need to understand gender. Thank you very much.